Shall we just start, or shall we wait for Brett?
Yeah, we're behind.
So, hello everyone. We're into 6, as the screen reads, and my name is Jeroen.
I'm Brendon.
Hope everyone is all right. Afternoon hasn't been too long yet. We have about 108 slides for you. So brace yourself. We're going to try and go through it quite quickly. But we want to give a good overview of the unit. This is the 5th year our unit is going to run. So we've been doing it for 4 years here in the AA, and also me and Brendon running an office in London, which is based near London Bridge in South London. So we're currently sort of having quite a lot of fun developing projects that are a bit in between academic research and trying out full-scale projects in China at the moment, which is trying to incorporate ideas about sustainability, working with really high-density sites. We have a team at the office, which we're also bringing to the unit this year. That's why I'm trying to show it. The top left, we have Andrea Buckley, who has been teaching grasshopper workshops since several years and will continue to do that with the unit. And the bottom right, we have James Chung, who is somewhere in the back there as well, who's taking on a bigger role this year with the unit, teaching workshops around scripting, visualization, and other design methodologies. So just to give you an overview of how our research has been developing over the last 4 years, we have started in the past with focus on materiality, prototyping, fabrication, and then trying to create projects that work within dense urban locations, finding balance between solid and void, between massing and open space. Last year we started with a new agenda that started with open space and tried to find the materiality and the process with that for each individual project afterwards. We really like this methodology, and we want to continue this year, aiming to increase the scope of research from local social processes that we did last year to a more citywide connectivity for this year. The title is Deep Planning, which we will do through using a single site in London for the entire year. And so the unit operates between fields of urbanism, innovative methods for design and construction, to try and explore opportunities to generate new types of urban architectures that fit the contemporary challenges that face the city today. As I mentioned, the title Deep Planning is a term that was introduced in 1999 from a sort of small avant-garde group of architects working with new digital tools. The ambition was to address user processes as a driver for design, mapping the spatial characteristics of movement flows and durations of those over time. So deep planning is based on a deep understanding of the city, being able to see the underlying networks of the dynamic relationships, understanding it as an ecological system rather than, or similar to the systems we see in nature. We consider the city's many functions, the interactions between flows, material, and people, as the economic and cultural drivers of the life in the city. And we use the ongoing negotiations between shops, shoppers, companies, and individuals, attractions, and visitors to inform the materialization of the public spaces. The arrangement of programs around public spaces and their long-term success will ultimately be driven by the market and the system of choice that the inhabitants of the city have. So the longer-term materialization of the city is the result of the pressures, the way we see it, the forces that force the city to continuously adapt, evolve, and regenerate itself as it grows over time. As Winston Churchill said when he visited the AA in 1924, buildings are an inevitable outcome of our combined culture and economy, and in turn their physical characteristics determine how we function within the larger networks of activities and exchange.
that.
I'll do the voiceover.
Yeah.
This is a video done by John in our unit last year. Can you make it live?
Is it?
Let's stop. Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Which is a pity. It's really funny when you hear him talk about his observations in Hanoi. Last year we went to Vietnam and we studied this phenomena that I just mentioned. How is the dynamic processes in the city sort of instrumental for how the public life and the sort of social economic activities take place? So what he studied here, it's probably stopping again, sorry for that, is a small island within a sort of a crossroad, a fork within the roads, where vendors would come and set up little shops within that island where the traffic would whiz all around all the time. And he's using the video to study how that process works, how the interaction between the people that buy things from the vendors and the vendors themselves sort of evolves over the course of a day. They're finding some interesting phenomena about, for instance, when the police come, all the vendors would run away and then would quickly come back when the police would disappear again. And what's interesting is it's continuously changing and never sort of regulated. People just looking at the camera and things like that. Here's a garbage bag, for instance, that someone throws, and it starts to form part of that island of obstacle in the crossroads, and it starts to change the shape of the flows around within that urban space. So we see this as a model for how to think about architecture. We can design projects using these principles that take advantage of the flows of people and play out this negotiation between buying and selling, or attracting and visiting.
And this is totally contingent upon the fact that there's actually a kind of these pockets of space that people are occupying within the city. So what we're noticing in Vietnam is that actually these kind of spaces, which form a kind of economic space for activity, become a kind of socially cohesive space within the city as well. And so last year, if we were dealing with the kind of small pockets of in-between space that form the social and economic adhesive of the city, this year we want to address the kind of central civic spaces in the city, spaces that we think are kind of shaped by the character of the city and will shape the character of the city in turn. And we think that because now people predominantly interact online, people are building their identities virtually, this actually could mean that the physical space of the city is becoming even more critical for people to identify with other inhabitants and with the city itself. So for instance, this is an image just taken last week of the protesters in Hong Kong. Demonstrations are always organized online, but they manifest and climax in a physical space. We think that designed open civic spaces in the city serve as a vital physical platform where a kind of collision of ideas, cultures, and experiences can... Right, yeah. We think it's a sort of platform from which a progressive societal shift can emerge because of the conflict that manifests inside of the physical space. We also want to propose architectural interventions that emerge as institutions in the city for exchange, negotiation, and a kind of cultural fermentation. This is an article from The Guardian last week, and it's kind of highlighting the problems with the current development models, which are really kind of overcoming London, but also the rest of the world. We're thinking that there's a set of stakeholders with a very limited set of interests, which include kind of short-term profitability. I'm talking about the developers mostly here, and a kind of global competition. But this neglects other issues that would happen at the smaller scale. So we feel that it's possible to conceive of models that not only bring a short-term economic benefit, but can also spur larger economic growth, cultural exchange, and foster the type of conflict and interaction that drive a beautiful progress in the city. So counter to current models of thinking and structuring development, we're seeking to design frameworks that become a stage for expression, participation, conflict negotiation, between the city's inhabitants. The goal is being that we want to stimulate emergent outcomes that drive innovation and are kind of uncannily suited to a certain place and time, but become, in the end, holistically sustainable. So this type of process can be harnessed by the architects, and we understand this at the urban scale as an opportunity to design systems that are living, breathing systems, open-ended to allow user participation and negotiation over time, and also lead to states of equilibrium after things have been resolved to certain degrees. These again will of course collapse. So in reference to this quote by Shumi, we want to invent buildings that are catalysts within the city and facilitate, intensify, and mold the character of the place.
So as I mentioned, we plan to work with a single site in London for the whole year. London is, as many other cities around the world, subject to an ongoing process of urbanization, with more and more people moving into cities, putting pressures on infrastructure, housing, services, the public spaces. So right now, London is planning to densify with an unprecedented number of high-rise projects, changing the skyline and also the social consistency of the city, probably forever. But as in most cities, this development is mostly driven by economical forces, with individual buildings sprouting up by sort of development opportunities. And this map shows sort of the scale of the problem, as some people see it. There's more than 200 towers now approved, high-rise towers all over London, triggering questions about lack of consultation and whether the sort of level of design does justice to London's legacy of radical innovation. For instance, we can see in projects such as Robin Hood Gardens, Lloyd's Bank, Barbican Centre, etc. So we want to take one of these areas that is earmarked for new development, the South Bank, as our site for the year's work. Using the area between Waterloo Station, Jubilee Gardens to the top, and the National Theatre. This area has a particular history of really interesting, extraordinary architectural ambition and experimentation. It was the site of the Festival of Britain in 1951, which was held to give Britons a feeling of recovery and progress and to promote better quality design in the rebuilding of Britain after the Second World War. And the Royal Festival Hall there in the middle is still standing as a showcase modernist building, one of the first ones in Britain, intentionally provocative, showing openness and publicness. This same site has been continuous development ever since, proposed to become a sort of new urban townscape, as in the proposal by Gordon Cullen, published in 1966, which featured inhabitable bridges, terraces to create a socially and culturally vibrant new center. However, it became quite disused and was renovated in 1999, adding restaurants and improved public spaces to extend the mixture of uses and expand them over longer periods of time throughout the day. So the area now has become so successful that the public character of the area is threatened, especially as part of the Shell Center is planned to be demolished and replaced by high-end residential towers. People not only worried about the changing skyline, but also the lack of planned public space as the sites are being filled to maximize profitability. So within our unit, we want to use these sort of real development sites to design our projects, but challenging the agenda of the development to include more social, cultural, diverse, and hybrid briefs. We quote Jaap Bakema, who was exhibited in this year's Venice Biennale, who advocated the idea of the open society in the image on the right, which was about creating sort of a layered, porous urban space that mixes public and private domains. So we want to design through understanding as an urban ecology, referencing visionary architects such as Metabolist and Paul Rudolph from the past, but also infusing our work with a much more adaptive sensibility to local site, environment, and social cultural factors, to drive a spatial differentiation that is more activity-based rather than sort of monumental. And we like to consider the city both as an urban framework that is open for the inhabitants to self-organize to a certain extent, as in Jona Friedman's proposals, but also something that can be specifically designed to be adapted to the local site conditions as if it has grown over time within the internal and external forces in the context. So we want to design architectural systems that form evolving urban centers, which basically allows each student to interpret that, choose a specific program mixture based on their personal ideas about what are the most valuable activities and experiences within city life.
So just to give an overview also of the kind of methodology and the sequence for the year. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, that's better. We will work throughout the year in groups as individuals, but always as part of a kind of collective research project inside of the entire unit. As we'd mentioned earlier, we've brought on board a few people this year, HTS tutor Doreen Bernath, James Chung, and Andrea Bugli, who will all be giving a series of workshops and also staging some kind of arguments within the unit between groups. We'll introduce a range of theorists, research agendas, tools, and techniques that you'll be asked to evolve, challenge, and modify constantly in keeping with the project's development. In term one, students will work in small groups of 2 to 3. As I mentioned, the groups will contribute to a larger conversation. At the end of term one, each group will insert their own one-to-one intervention into a site in South Bank. During the unit trip, we'll visit Tokyo. You'll be encouraged but not required to come to Shanghai for a workshop that we'll be doing with Tongji University as well. So in terms 2 and 3, students will then start to work individually and propose an urban architectural project for the site in South Bank that they've been working with. We'll begin the year by studying and documenting several places that we consider central urban neighborhoods in London and civic spaces. One of them is the Barbican, which agglomerates a range of mixed-use program and civic functions. Using a series of 3-dimensional civic spaces, pedestrian bridges, etc., it seeks to kind of liberate the social life of the building from the traffic of the streets below. However, we'll focus mainly on most of the exercises and the interventions in the South Bank area, in the place that Jeroen earlier highlighted. And we'll make reference to some historical research into how design features and civic policy can stimulate civic vibrancy and peculiar anomalies that would bring, hopefully, long-term benefits to the city. For instance, William White conducted research projects in New York in the 1960s to find correlations between the way that the architectural space was designed, the environmental factors in the space, and the way that people would behave, how long they would linger, if they would were they people watching or socializing in these spaces. So during the workshops, you'll be given actually a kind of pre-prepared kit of tools that you can assemble, and you'll be challenged to continue to modify. And the idea with these tools is to kind of expose these invisible fields of information and the boundaries of these invisible territories that exist within a site. And what we're looking for really, like I mentioned, is the kind of correlations between space, environment, connectivity, program, and the collective and individual behaviors that will arise out of those kind of combinations of things in a sort of chemical reaction way. So we'll use diagrams really to test assumptions and help mold the thesis argument about what civicness is. We're asking really how we as designers can provoke situations or events that are critical to stimulating exchange in the city. This is one example from last year. Laurens Berger spent a couple of weeks at the Royal Festival Hall meticulously documenting what everyone was doing through photos and mapping. And by the end, he had sort of gained a believable ability to predict where certain types of users would stay in the building, or what types of places they would want to use, solely based on the architectural features. Was it a high ceiling? Was there a lot of sunlight, etc.? He recognized that also certain fringe activities or anomalies in behavior would occur commonly under certain particular architectural conditions. So he used this knowledge to design a conflict negotiation platform, which was really a series of movable walls and built-in furniture. And the kind of key topic that he was dealing with was how would he protect the interests of an individual or a small group, while at the same time allowing the larger groups of people to still use the space in the way that they wanted to. John and Sungbum last year spent several weeks at the Barbican exposing the way in which the design features would provoke patterns of movement exchange amongst people that were inhabiting the space. And they designed a system of variable porosity structure to filter light in people's movement. They produced some physical tests in a file-to-factory process, generating these geometries and directly outputting them to the laser cutter. Their intervention was grown based on the patterns they had mapped and was intended to serve as a seed to kind of stimulate subtle shifts in the way that the space was being used socially. They designed an in-between space with varied conditions of sunlight and urban furniture, which produced an experimental platform aimed at provoking some unusual exchange.
So prototyping is another important method of the project development within the unit, as it promotes quick sort of iterations of design and testing, inventiveness, and a sort of hands-on design development that we really like. So we always go to Hook Park in a workshop in the beginning of the year, also using the workshops here to test how to sort of create systems, structural systems, spatial systems that can form three-dimensional urban space. For instance, last year as well, this example by Lena and Alessandro, they were studying the Barbican Center interior, and they found relationships between different types of behavior and the sort of intimacy of public spaces, as they called it. So they devised a fabrication method specifically to create a field of columns that through the different dimensions could form a series of different sort of urban rooms, also with variable intimacy. So as Brendon mentioned, this year we work with Doreen Bernath as well on a sort of very small seminar series that is integrated completely with the design development of the project within the unit, helping students to formulate contextual frameworks and thesis statements for their projects. So we'll go through some small readings, discussion sessions, which will address topics such as how to plan for the unplanned, how is the city changing because of the use of new information technologies, how can the role of the architect address the control mechanisms of urban spaces. So using a range of theories and interpretations of deep planning, we will help students to be self-critical and judge the predictability of success of their speculative proposals. One example of a experiment that was based in theoretical research was done in 2013 on the AA Terrace by Sungbin Christine Fay, who made a sort of growing furniture installation that was implemented through mapping the behavior of the people on the terrace. Using certain rules to place objects over time, they aim to create sort of new pockets of social space and try to influence people's behavior, stimulating to do things they would normally not do there.
Yeah, as mentioned, we'll be going to Tokyo. We'll also be holding a joint workshop with Tongji University in Shanghai, really just about exploring the urban networks of the city and exposing some of the same correlations that we've been discussing earlier. As one of the most dense and technologically sophisticated cities in the world, Tokyo is a perfect case study of a culturally distinct, non-stop city. The city really reveals the underlayers or the overlayers, let's say, of this three-dimensional interweaving of networks and spaces. I guess we'll see both. There's just a thick layering of networks that's happening throughout the city. And these are accommodating us, the intense fluctuations in movement and interaction. We want to document the tactile, the social, and the cultural to gain an understanding of the economic and kind of productive forces that are driving the local ecology. We want to ask what would comprise an important civic space in Tokyo and which features distinguish it as such. And we want to visit pivotal projects that have asked questions we consider critical in the unit as well. For instance, how do we think about cycles of use and plan for the unplanned? How might we set up frameworks for self-organization to harvest the intelligence of the collective city? We'll also visit many of the projects that have made Tokyo a kind of veritable showroom of icons and the latest architectural trends.
So continuing in London after the trip, we'll work with individual students on their projects using the sort of collective information model that was built up in term 1 as a departure point. We will expand our research from only looking at the civic space to full-scale urban interventions, adding programs, buildings, infrastructure to the ingredients of a societal urban space. And this phase is usually a sort of crafting of generative design systems for each project, unique, where students using a list of precedents that we provide to kickstart their development.
We are
looking into
intermediate
clustering
11
strategies to organize connectivity, network programs, and the sort of strategic use of voids for access to circulation and light. Each student will reference strategic projects that have explored innovative ideas regarding structural, environmental, and programmatic performance, aiming to enrich our discussions within the unit about techniques to catalyze cultural, socio-economic activities within the city. So this is just a quick snapshot of the design process throughout the year, showing the relation between term 1 and term 2 and 3. In term 1, we study the real world situation, trying to map and understand correlations between physical spaces and activities that take place. Then in the individual projects, we develop speculative proposals intended to generate new kind of activities again. So these are calibrated through our earlier knowledge of the correlations between architecture and urban life.
As just a final section of the presentation, we want to show a few student projects which really highlight some of the key themes of the unit that we've actually kind of pieced together through looking at the last 4 years and that we'd like to continue developing. Each student will develop an individual thesis argument defining the role of architecture within the evolving challenges of urban planning and design. Students should address these key unit methods. However, it's likely that you'll choose to place more emphasis on one of them than the others. And the first one being materiality. Materiality is discussed at a very early stage in the unit and investigated in overlap with TS. Like Ryan, we want to use TS directly to inform the project development. And an example of that would be something like the structural studies informing the formal language of the building or putting certain constraints on the building. Environmental principles driving something like a solid and void strategy for the building. So this project by Armeijde used a flexible concrete casting system to create a very tower configuration which is intended to accommodate a range of living space types. Last year, Time studied a minimal surface form finding technique for casting multi-storied inhabitable canopies on site. Jamie invented a flexible silicon mold and tube formwork, which when assembled allowed him to cast a series of reinforced concrete space frame structures within the site in Ho Chi Minh City. These informed an architectural lattice for user-customized inhabitation.
So Jamie also brought in this topic of self-organization, focusing heavily on the potential for mixing different scales of urban activities together. Using the project as a sort of open framework, taking on specific conditions, sizes of activities found in the field research in Vietnam, and juxtaposing them in new ways and mixtures in a stacked vertical system that really intensifies the local condition in the site. The resulting proposal was a aim to upgrade the sort of traditional Vietnamese street life activities and allow them to adapt and absorb new types of dynamic city life. Noreen's project, also an example of self-organization driving the project development. She proposed an adjustable market city fabric that allowed for highly adapted, efficient use of the very limited space in Beijing. Using movable walls and roofs that would be shifted open during the day, sort of like floodgates, letting the swarm of economic and social activities flow through the project. The market, food stalls, and small live-work spaces would be opened up to the city to foster the sort of microeconomies of the local neighborhoods. And in the evening, they would close up again to provide necessary security, privacy, and space for family activities. Jisu's project from last year, which was just nominated for a Reba medal, is also driven through self-organization principles, but much more vertical agglomeration of self-organized housing units clustered around a series of spaces, which range from public to semi-private. Aiming to drive or stimulate user group interaction and negotiation, really trying to create a sort of critical mass with the size of the project.
Continuing on to a theme of growth, Victor designed a project that grew over time out of a set of self-similar pods, of one of which they constructed at 1-to-1 in the first term. You can see it on the upper left-hand corner here at kind of full scale. This system that he worked on was adapted to create a series of open spaces underneath the structure, which would accommodate a civic space and adjacent activities within Chongqing, where the project is based. The project sought to enable configurations that would allow for a very different let's say a range of different program types. Nathalie designed a mixed urban neighborhood by creating microclimates to incubate a thriving user-driven growth and social spaces in Beijing. She was seeking to foster a unique niche of economic and social activity and sought to exploit a series of tunnels that are existing under the city in Beijing. These tunnels become a kind of political underground for the emerging social movements in the city that is very heavily regulated by the central government in China.
So, understanding the site as a both physical and political context, several of our projects have challenged the boundaries and territories that normally exist in each place. Stavros project, for instance, incorporates a variable porosity system that interweaves elevated street networks, waterfront access, and private spaces for a site in Hong Kong, where he was mixing specific cultural phenomena, such as the typical work-live conditions in Hong Kong's shop houses and historic neighborhoods. And similarly, Haoji's project was using a porous, minimal surface structure on top of an existing market to create living units as well as new market spaces and communal areas. And the project makes a case for a sort of medium rise but very high density living, adding a new type of structure into an existing urban area, sort of perfectly adapted to fit within the site. So the final project we want to show combines many of the themes we just showed. Was done by Kevin, investigating in the beginning only concrete casting methods to allow for variation within the system, but then moving on to a sort of rule-based massing development within the sites, also in Hong Kong, adapting the building shape and porosity to the existing urban fabric in the city. So the building introduces apartments, additional escalators, and a market/park at the top, with a section showing a rich interior spaces created by intersecting public circulation and housing. The carefully calibrated project is driven by relational qualities and performance, offering the city a differentiated fabric that can accommodate the contingencies and ambiguities of the city. It is both technically innovative and politically charged, creating a new layered civic space amongst private building zones, operating at local and regional scale, mixing different social groups and creating new types of spaces that form a platform for the hyper-urbanity aimed at facilitating progressive change. Which summarizes, together with this quote, exactly what we're looking for in the coming year. Thanks.